Before paleontologists named them, before museums mounted them, before textbooks classified them, people were already standing in front of their bones. Massive vertebrae pulled from riverbanks, teeth the size of daggers, fragments of skulls too large to belong to any living creature. And without carbon dating, without evolutionary theory, without geology as we know it, they still had to explain them. Were they monsters? Proof of a forgotten catastrophe? Remnants of a world that once looked very different? And here is the question few people ask. When ancient people encountered the remains of giant creatures, how did those discoveries shape their understanding of creation, judgment, time, and divine power? Because the conversation between prehistoric life and sacred narrative did not begin in laboratories. It began in the human imagination. And once that connection formed, it never fully disappeared. Welcome to Hidden Origins. Today we explore a question that lives between stone and scripture. Let's begin. The word dinosaur did not exist until the 19th century, but the bones did. Long before modern science gave them taxonomy and Latin names, fossilized remains surfaced in fields, deserts, and cliffs across the ancient world. Farmers in China unearthed enormous bones and called them dragon bones. In parts of the Mediterranean, massive femurs were believed to belong to giants described in local legends. To ancient eyes, these were not prehistoric reptiles. They were evidence. But evidence of what? Here is where things become fascinating. The Bible, like many ancient texts, speaks of creatures that defy ordinary scale, beings described with imagery so powerful that scholars still debate their meaning. The book of Job describes Behemoth, a creature with bones like tubes of bronze. Leviathan appears as a chaos serpent, untamable and immense. For centuries, these descriptions were interpreted symbolically, poetic representations of divine power and cosmic order. But when enormous fossilized bones began to circulate in medieval Europe, something shifted. Writers and theologians did not have evolutionary timelines. They did not possess extinction theory. The concept that entire species could disappear was not yet scientifically framed. So they interpreted the physical discoveries through the only intellectual structure available to them: sacred history. If giant bones existed, then giant creatures must have existed. If giant creatures existed, they must have lived in the world described by Scripture. And if they no longer lived among humans, perhaps something dramatic had changed the world. This is where flood narratives entered the conversation. Across multiple ancient cultures, not just within biblical tradition, stories of a great deluge appear, a catastrophic flood that reshaped the earth, destroyed civilizations, and altered the natural order. To early interpreters, fossils became physical witnesses of that upheaval, not evidence of deep geological time, but evidence of divine judgment. Now pause here. Notice something important. This wasn't ignorance, it was coherence. People interpret new information through existing frameworks. That is how the human mind works. We integrate unfamiliar data into familiar structure. The idea that massive creatures once roamed the earth did not contradict belief systems at the time. It strengthened them. Because if creation was vast, powerful, and mysterious, then giant creatures only magnified that mystery. But the real shift was still centuries away. When modern geology emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, scientists began noticing sedimentary layers stacked like pages of a book, each containing fossils from different life forms. And the pattern suggested something radical. Time itself
was deeper than anyone imagined.
This is where tension quietly entered the conversation. Not loud, not explosive, but profound. If the Earth was older than previously assumed, if species had lived and vanished long before humans, then how should ancient texts be understood? Literally? Symbolically? Theologically? Or was there another way to see the relationship altogether? This was no longer just about bones. It was about narrative authority, about whether sacred texts were scientific documents or something more enduring. And the debate that followed would reshape theology, science, and public imagination for generations. But before we move into that turning point, we need to understand something deeper. Why do humans instinctively link fossils to moral stories? Why do giant bones trigger myths of judgment, monsters, and divine power instead of simple biological curiosity? That psychological thread may be more revealing than the bones themselves. We'll explore how ancient flood traditions, extinction theory, and early fossil discoveries collided and quietly transformed how people read both nature and scripture. If this exploration is expanding how you see the conversation, subscribe now, because we're only at the beginning and the deeper layers are still ahead. In the early 19th century, something extraordinary happened. Not a discovery, but a realization. Scientists began to understand that fossils were not random curiosities. They were arranged in patterns. Certain creatures only appeared in certain rock layers. Some forms vanished completely above specific geological boundaries. For the first time, extinction became undeniable. An extinction is a powerful idea, because extinction means this: life existed, and then it did not. No survivors, no descendants, no continuity. For many thinkers shaped by sacred history, this created tension. The traditional reading of creation emphasized completeness. A finished world declared good, a world sustained by divine order. So how do you reconcile that with entire species erased long before humans ever appeared? Some responded defensively, others responded creatively. A number of early Christian naturalists began proposing something nuanced. Perhaps the days of creation were not literal 24-hour periods, but symbolic epochs, long ages through which God gradually formed the world. This was not a modern compromise. It was an attempt to preserve theological meaning while acknowledging geological evidence. At the same time, fossil discoveries were accelerating. Massive skeletons emerged from quarries in England. In 1842, the term Dinosauria was officially coined to describe these terrible lizards. Museums began reconstructing them, giving the public its first glimpse of creatures that seemed almost mythological in scale.
And that's when something psychologically fascinating occurred. The dragons of medieval imagination suddenly had bones. Creatures once confined to legend now had anatomical structure, measurable dimensions, and scientific classification. Yet the mythic resonance didn't disappear, it evolved. Instead of asking, "Did dragons exist?" people began asking, what kind of world allows something like this to exist? The question shifted from fantasy to ontology, from folklore to cosmology. Meanwhile, biblical interpretation was also evolving. Scholars increasingly recognized that ancient Near Eastern texts, including Genesis, shared literary patterns with surrounding cultures. Creation accounts were structured, poetic, theological. They were not laboratory reports. This realization reframed the conversation. Perhaps the Bible was not trying to answer
how old the Earth is. Perhaps it was answering why the world exists at all. Those are fundamentally different questions, and when you separate them, much of the perceived conflict softens, but not entirely. Because dinosaurs introduce something more than geological timescales. They introduce dominance. For over 160 million years, these creatures ruled ecosystems. They were not minor footnotes. They were the primary biological actors on the planet. And then they vanished. From a theological perspective, that raises profound questions. If creation unfolds across vast ages, if species rise and fall, if extinction is built into natural history, then what does that say about permanence, about purpose? Some interpret extinction as evidence of a fallen world. Others see it as part of dynamic creativity, a process where life continuously reshapes itself across epochs. But here is the deeper insight. Dinosaurs forced humanity to confront humility. For most of recorded history, humans viewed themselves near the center of creation's timeline. The fossil record quietly relocated us to the very end, newcomers on an ancient stage. And that relocation carries psychological weight. It challenges anthropocentrism. It challenges chronological assumptions. It even challenges how we interpret sacred narrative arcs. But perhaps it also enriches them. Because if sacred texts speak about meaning, responsibility, and moral consciousness, then the long pre-human history of life does not negate that message, it contextualizes it. The Earth is older, life is more complex, and humanity's appearance becomes not less significant, but more mysterious. We arrived late. Why? That question lingers beneath both science and theology. As we move into the most intense layer of this discussion, where evolutionary theory, modern skepticism, and literalist readings collide, because the real conflict was never about bones, it was about interpretation. If this journey is deepening your perspective, subscribe now. The most challenging questions are still ahead.
By the mid-19th century, the discussion changed permanently. It was no longer just about fossils. It was about mechanisms. When Charles Darwin introduced the theory of natural selection, he didn't simply extend geological time. He introduced a process through which life diversified gradually across immense spans of history. Dinosaurs were no longer isolated giants in a vanished world. They became ancestors, part of a branching biological tree that eventually led through countless transformations to birds, mammals, and ultimately humans. And this is where the real friction intensified, because evolutionary theory did something subtle but disruptive. It reframed creation as process instead of event. Instead of a finished world emerging fully formed, life appeared dynamic, adaptive, and unfinished. Species rose, competed, transformed, and disappeared. To some believers, this sounded like randomness replacing purpose. To others, it sounded like a deeper kind of design, one embedded not in instant formation, but in unfolding development. But the tension wasn't only theological, it was existential. If humans evolved from earlier life forms, if extinction is natural, if dominance shifts across eras, then humanity's position looks less fixed, less permanent, less central. And that realization unsettled many. Throughout the 20th century, public debates often framed this as a war, science versus faith. Dinosaurs became symbolic weapons in cultural conflict. Museums were seen as challengers to scripture.
Literal readings were defended as safeguards of tradition. But beneath the noise, serious scholars on both sides were asking more refined questions. Is Genesis intended as cosmological poetry? Can divine intention operate through natural mechanisms? Does evolutionary history undermine meaning or expand it? The conversation matured. And then came another scientific shock. In the late 20th century, evidence mounted that a massive asteroid impact contributed to the extinction of the dinosaurs. A sudden, catastrophic event reshaped global ecosystems. Ironically, catastrophe re-entered the narrative, but this time through physics, not theology. A cosmic object strikes Earth. Dust clouds darken skies. Climate shifts dramatically. Dominant species collapse. And from that destruction, mammals expand, including the lineage that would eventually produce us. Notice the pattern. First, extinction was unimaginable. Then it became geological reality. Then it became evolutionary necessity. And finally, it became part of cosmic vulnerability. Dinosaurs were not simply replaced. They were removed, and their absence created ecological space. Here, an unexpected philosophical idea emerges. Without dinosaur extinction, large mammals may never have flourished. Primates may never have evolved as they did. Human history may never have unfolded. Our existence, in part, rests upon their disappearance.
That realization reframes the emotional tone. Dinosaurs are not merely relics of a lost world. They are prerequisites for ours. And suddenly, the tension shifts from conflict to interdependence. Perhaps the question is not, do dinosaurs contradict sacred texts, but rather, how does deep time reshape our understanding of creation, purpose, and continuity? Because whether one reads Genesis literally, metaphorically, or theologically, the central themes remain strikingly human. Order emerging from chaos, life emerging from formlessness, responsibility given to conscious beings. Dinosaurs don't erase those themes. They expand the stage on which they unfold. Still, for many, unresolved questions linger. Why would a creator allow extinction on such scale? Why design ecosystems that collapse? Why construct a history so long before humanity appears? These are not scientific questions, they are philosophical. And philosophy is where this conversation ultimately lives. In the coming segment, we step back from conflict entirely. We'll examine what dinosaurs actually reveal about the way humans seek meaning and why the tension between stone and scripture may be less about contradiction and more about perspective. If you're still with this journey, subscribe now, because the final layer brings the entire picture into focus. Step back from the debates. Step back from literal versus metaphorical, from science versus theology, from timelines and terminology. Look instead at something simpler. Human beings found enormous bones in the earth and asked questions. That instinct, the need to interpret, is the real story. Dinosaurs are not just biological entities from deep time. They are mirrors. They reflect how we process mystery. When ancient cultures uncovered fossils, they folded them into stories of dragons, giants, and cosmic battles. Those stories weren't scientific errors. They were frameworks, attempts to give meaning to overwhelming scale. Later, when geology matured and extinction was understood, fossils became evidence of time so vast it redefined human self-understanding. And still, the interpretation continued.
That continuity reveals something profound. The tension between dinosaurs and sacred narrative was never about bones. It was about narrative authority. Science asks, how did this happen? Faith asks, what does this mean? When those questions are confused, conflict emerges. When they are distinguished, clarity appears. Dinosaurs answer the how with extraordinary detail. Layered sediment, radiometric dating, evolutionary branching, mass extinction models. Sacred texts answer the why through moral and metaphysical language, purpose, order, consciousness, responsibility. These are different categories of explanation. And categories matter. The mistake has often been expecting ancient scripture to function as a paleontology manual, or expecting science to resolve metaphysical purpose. Neither was designed for that. But here is where dinosaurs offer something unexpectedly beautiful. They expand awe. A world that held 30-meter reptiles roaming lush prehistoric forests is not smaller than a world described in sacred poetry. It is larger, more layered, more intricate. The timeline deepens. The ecosystems diversify. The creative process, however one understands it, becomes more complex. Instead of reducing wonder, deep time amplifies it. And perhaps that is the key shift. When people first heard about dinosaurs, many felt threatened. If the Earth was older than assumed, did that weaken faith? But over time, many thinkers realized something different. Meaning is not fragile. A long history does not eliminate purpose. Complex processes do not erase intention. Extinction does not negate significance. In fact, fragility can intensify value. Dinosaurs dominated the planet for over 160 million years and vanished. Humanity has existed for a geological blink of an eye. That perspective introduces humility. We are not the first rulers of this world. We may not be the last biological actors to reshape it. And within that humility lies responsibility. If extinction is part of natural history, we now possess the unprecedented ability to accelerate it. Dinosaurs remind us that dominance does not guarantee permanence. Sacred narratives remind us that power carries accountability.
When viewed together, not as enemies, but as lenses, a richer picture emerges. Stone tells us where we came from biologically. Story tells us how to live meaningfully. One traces physical ancestry. The other addresses moral direction. They're not competitors, they're dimensions. And maybe that is the truth that was rarely emphasized. Dinosaurs do not threaten belief, they stretch it. They invite us to imagine a creation older, deeper, and more dynamic than early interpreters could have conceived, without necessarily dissolving the existential questions that sacred texts attempt to answer. The bones remain silent, but our interpretation of them reveals who we are: curious, pattern-seeking, meaning-making, standing between deep time and eternal questions. If this exploration has expanded your perspective, not toward division, but toward deeper understanding, subscribe now. Because at Hidden Origins, we don't chase controversy, we uncover context, and the deeper you look, the more connected everything becomes.